Hello, in this video we'll talk about dynamic and static typing. Okay, but before we start talking about dynamic and static typing, let's talk about some terms that will help us to understand the dynamic and static typing. Okay, so we have something called the source code. What is the source code? We've talked about these terminologies before, or these terms before at the beginning, but we're just going to go through them very quick and try to refresh our memory, which will help us to understand the difference between dynamic and static. Okay, so first let's take a look at the source code. What is the source code? Source code is actually your original code. That's the program or the Python program that you type, that one that has, for example, print statement, input statement, and so on and so forth. So this is what we call it, source code. In order for the source code to be executed in your machine, we need first to translate it, because computer cannot understand the source code that we have, which is written in Python or Java or whatever the language. Okay, so we need to convert this code into some type of computer language that will be understandable by the computer. This we call the translation. Okay, after we finish translating the code, we can go and run our program. Basically, we just need, that's going to be the time when we execute our program, and our program is going to ask us for example, inputs and display the output and so on and so forth. This happens if we are using a compiled programming language such as Java or C and C++. This is going to happen after we finish compilation. Okay, after we compile the code. Okay, question is, what is the compiled? What does that mean, the code is compiled? Well, code is translated before the runtime. So there's a stage between writing the code and running the code. During the translation, that code has to be compiled in some programming languages such as Java and C. That being said, that program will be checked everything, the syntax error, and it's going to check everything, the types, the variables that you have, the function, all of them is going to be compiled. Make sure the program is correct and has no syntax error whatsoever, and then you can run it. In the interpreter, or in the interpreter programming languages, this translation is going to go on the fly. So you probably already noticed that Python is one of those languages. Okay, so as you translate, once you write the code, you run it, and the translation is going to go on the fly from the code to the runtime. And that's why sometimes when you write the Python, you will notice that you are getting some result, and in the middle of the program there is a syntax error. It's going to stop and give you an error. Okay, all right, that's about the general terms. Let's talk about right now the dynamic and static typing, but let's start with the statically typed languages. There are some languages such as Java, C, and C++. We call them statically typed languages. Why we call them statically typed languages? Because these type of languages, the type of the variable is known at the compile time. So I need to know exactly what is the variable type. So if you create in your program, if you're writing a program in Java or C or C++, if you write a variable and you call this variable, for example, X is going to take an integer. Okay, so if you run your program, and if you give the value, if you assign X to a string, for example, the program is going to give you an error, because X, you said at the beginning before it was compiled, you said it's going to be dealing with integers. That means it's going to have to stay with integers. You cannot do it or change it. Okay, so in this way, the programmer needs to be very to have to specify exactly what type for each variable. The other type is the dynamic type languages, which is Python is one of them, and also Perl, Ruby, PHP, and JavaScript. What is the dynamic? Dynamic, basically, you have the variable, and as you run it, that will, in the runtime, you can assign to it whatever data type that you want. So if you have in your program X as a variable, and you assign it when you run it one time as an integer, and then you assign it again as a string, it's going to work, it's going to accept it. Okay, that's kind of like pretty cool. That will give you, as a programmer, like it will give you a little quicker time, because you don't have to specify every type you have to use in your program. Here's an example, and this is very simple example just to show you how dynamic is Python. Okay, so let's assume that we have this function. Okay, and you can try this one by yourself and call the function add, and we say this function takes two parameters, x and y, and what the function is going to do, it's just going to return x plus y. Okay, and they want you to print it out, the result, by calling the add with 2 and 3, and then call it, which is both of them integers, and then call it add with 2.6, which is a float, and 3, which is integer, and call it the third time with the word hi and bye, which both of them are strings. So, and you will see in Python it's going to work. So what's going to happen when I call it the first time? X is going to be mapped to 2 and y is going to be mapped to 3. So the result is going to be returning 5. So this one is going to print 5, the first line. Okay. When I call the second time, x is going to be mapped to 2.6 and y is going to be 3. So the result is going to be 5.6. Okay. For the last time, when I call the add with two strings, x is going to be hi, y is going to be bye, and the result is going to be hi bye with no space between them. If this add function was written in Java or C++, it's going to give you an error because you had, when you define it, for example, at the beginning over here, you have to tell me, is x and y going to be integers, floats, strings? What are they going to be? So if I say, for example, this add is going to be for integers, okay, this call is going to work. The other calls are not going to, they're not going to work because this is not integer. These are not integers. So that being said, I have to define another language. I can, another program, another function. I can call it add for float, add for strings, and so on and so forth. So I can add I can have two arguments for the add string, for example, but I cannot use one add function for all different type of data. And that's about the dynamic data type. So you see how Python is kind of cool and pretty dynamic. With one function, I can call it 3 times with 3 different data types. If it was statically typing or static programming language, I cannot use the same function for 3 different calls that has 3 different type of data types. Okay, I hope this is clear.